Buenas tardes a todas y a todos quienes nos están siguiendo de distintos lugares. Es un honor para nosotros continuar con este segundo encuentro del ciclo La Humanidad Quebrada, 80 años del inicio de la solución final. Ya hemos tenido el encuentro anterior, el honor de contar con Christopher Browning, y en el día de hoy tenemos también el honor de contar con uno de los historiadores más prestigiosos de la historia del Holocausto y quien ha tenido una enorme generosidad al aceptar nuestra invitación. Para nosotros es un enorme privilegio contar con su presencia. Peter Hayes estudió en Bowdoin y Oxford y se doctoró en Yale. Entre 1980 y 2016 fue profesor de la cátedra Theodore Seb Weiss Holocaust Educational Foundation de Historia y Alemán de Northwestern University en los Estados Unidos. Sus publicaciones han ganado varios premios y han sido traducidas al chino, francés, alemán, italiano, japonés, polaco, eslovaco y español. Entre otros títulos, sus trabajos sobre el Holocausto incluyen ¿Por qué? Explicando el Holocausto, y How Was It Possible? A Holocaust Reader. ¿Cómo fue posible? Una historia del Holocausto. Y The Oxford Handbook of Holocaust Studies, el manual de Oxford para los estudios sobre el Holocausto que editó junto con John Roth. Entre 2014 y 2019 presidió el comité académico del Museo Memorial del Holocausto en Washington. Fue galardonado con diversos premios por su tarea docente. Es un activo disertante sobre historia alemana y del Holocausto en los Estados Unidos y en el exterior. Peter Hayes, le damos ahora sí la bienvenida y lo escuchamos. Tenemos el honor de poder escucharlo.
Muchas gracias a todos.
I'm going to put up on the screen a presentation which outlines my remarks this evening, which I hope will make it a little easier for you to follow what I'm going to be saying. Thank you first to the translators. I'm embarrassed that I don't speak Spanish. If I were doing this as a lecture in Berlin or in Paris, I could speak the language, but I can't speak Spanish, I'm afraid. Now, in order to understand why it is that the German government made a decision to kill every last man, woman, and child of Jewish heritage in Europe, not even of Jewish religion, of Jewish descent, in order to understand why the German government made this decision and why it made the decision when it did, we have to talk a little bit about the background. Because from 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, until 1941, when this decision occurred, there was a transition in German policy. Initially, the German government leaders and the Nazi Party leaders said that their goal with regard to the Jews, and at first they said this only in Germany, was the removal of the Jews. In German, die Entfernung, to take them out of the sphere of German control. But by 1941, the vocabulary they were using was different. It was annihilation. The word in German is Vernichtung. Now, the evolution from this policy of removal to this policy of annihilation was gradual, but it was continuous. And that evolution starts, its departure point is this. There was a logic, if you will, or a momentum is another way to say it. Now, to understand why this policy evolved the way it did, we have to start with the central ideological claims that the Nazi regime made about Jews. Their claim was that Jews are mortal enemies of Germany, that they are always out to undermine Germany. And therefore, the Nazis justified everything they did toward Jews as an act of self-defense. The ideology of Nazism depicted Jews as predators, as people who were always trying to damage the Germans. And they used various metaphors or analogies to describe this. One of them was that the Jews are vermin, fleas, bugs who carry disease. Another is that they were cancer cells. A third was that they were tubercular agents. All of these are vehicles to infect people. And because of that metaphor, this meant that always in the Nazi ideology of self-defense, there was an implicit possibility of murder, because germs and cancer cells and disease agents are things that you try to wipe out and remove. So though the Nazis came into power saying what they wanted to do was remove the Jews from Germany, this was backed by an ideological argument that said the Jews are always attacking us. Now, between 1933 and 1938, the Nazis tried to make life in Germany so miserable for Jews that they would leave. But they discovered by 1938 that they faced another element of their ideology, which was a problem. And this was the contradiction between the two things they claimed to most want. The first thing they claimed to most want was to expel, to drive the Jews out. But the second thing they wanted most to do was to expand, to take over territory in Europe, which would be their, what they said, Lebensraum, their living space. The problem was in 1938, they discovered that expulsion and expansion worked against each other. They had tried to drive the Jews out of Germany, and by mid-1938, they had driven perhaps 35% of the Jews out of the country. But then in 1938, they began to acquire new territory, first Austria, then the Sudetenland, the border regions of Czechoslovakia where German was spoken, and then in March of 1939, what we today call the Czech Republic. Every time they expanded, they acquired more Jews. And their target regions, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, were the areas in the world most densely populated by Jews. To try to expel and remove the Jews was the opposite of expanding into areas where there were millions of Jews. And so the Nazis began to realize around the time of the infamous Kristallnacht, the burning of the synagogues in Germany and so forth, that there was a mathematical contradiction between their objectives. And the expression of their realization is that more and more people in the upper reaches of the Nazi regime began to talk about the murder of the Jews, and they used a new word to describe that, Vernichtung, the annihilation of the Jews. When the number 2 man in the German Foreign Ministry used this word in November 1938, and when the SS newspaper, the bi-weekly newspaper of the SS, used this word later in the same month, and when Hitler himself used this word when he addressed the Reichstag in January of 1939, they talked about annihilation as a conditional event. If the Jews did not leave, then it would lead to the annihilation. But of course, in subsequent years, it became impossible for the Jews to leave. Not only was there the pre-war problem that other countries would not let them in, but after the beginning of the Second World War with the invasion of Poland, wartime conditions made it even more difficult for people to leave. So once this word emerged at the end of 1938, the beginning of 1939, the story of the next few years is a story of escalating misery and death inflicted on Jews. By the middle of 1941, more than 600,000 of them had died at the hands of Nazi policy, either cruelty or starvation or being worked to death and so forth. And at the same time, the places to which Jews could be sent seemed to be disappearing. The Nazis imagined that if in continuation of their expulsion policy, that perhaps they could push the Jews into remote parts of Poland. They also imagined that perhaps they could, after the victory over France, they could put the Jews in some obscure, faraway corner of the French Empire, like the island of Madagascar off Africa. Or they imagined, as they invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, that they could push the Jews up beyond the Arctic Circle. But all of these options closed Poland was conquered, and with it 2 million Jews. It was not an area in which to push more Jews. Madagascar was unreachable because the British Navy was in the way. And the Soviet Union, well, the war didn't end as rapidly as the Nazis hoped, and so that idea of pushing people away disappeared. And as the Germans began to plan for that invasion, they planned increasingly on killing Jews as they went. They planned on bringing death to the Jews that they would conquer in the regions of the Soviet Union that lay in the path of their armies. In the months before the invasion, long before the shooting start, Nazi planners set out to achieve what they called a house cleaning in the areas of the USSR. Now, the word in German for that is Flurbereinigung, which literally means the cleaning up of the entranceway into your house. They planned to kill all the Soviet officials who were in their path. They planned to kill Jewish men in their path because they thought the men might be at the kernel of opposition to the occupation. And they planned to kill all the people who they thought were superfluous eaters. The German army invaded the Soviet Union with a plan called in German the Hungerplan, the hunger plan. And what that meant was they knew that there was not enough, that they didn't have the ability to supply the massive invasion force with adequate food. It would have to live off the land. And that meant if it had to live off the territories it was conquering, the people who lived in those territories would have to be greatly reduced in numbers. The Germans planned from the beginning that up to 30 million people would die in the course of the German invasion. They also knew that they wanted no repetition of the problems they had encountered in Poland. What problems? When they ghettoized Jews, when they invaded Poland, they did not kill most of the Jews in their path. They killed some, but they did not kill most of them. They brought them together in ghettos. They concentrated them there. Well, these ghettos turned out to contain problems. They had to be fed, even if they were fed badly. They became, because the conditions the German imposed were so terrible, they became centers of disease. The Germans did not want to have either of these sorts of administrative issues in the new areas of the Soviet Union they conquered. So their plan to originally kill only the Jewish men in their path, by late July had become killing women and children as well. And the rule of thumb in marching into the Soviet Union was most Jews will be shot. Some Jews will be kept alive in rump ghettos to work for the advantage of the occupying power. In August of 1941, after the invasion had begun and after this policy had begun, the Germans brought in massive reinforcements, 30,000 SS men and policemen, to make sure that the killing was extensive enough to wipe out the populations they targeted. Now, while this was happening, the beginning of the Holocaust, the phase of it that is the Holocaust by shooting, the policy of bringing death to the Jews, behind the lines, German planners were making bigger objectives for their rule. Their ambitions escalated. And one way of starting to understand this is looking what happened between March and June of 1941 before the invasion began. The region of Poland that the Germans had occupied but not annexed was called the General Government, the area around Warsaw, Lublin, and so forth. Initially, the German plan was that this would be an area into which Germany would dump populations that the Reich did not want. But in March of 1941, Hitler began to tell the German Governor General of this region, a man named Hans Frank, he began to tell him that in the future, the occupied region was going to become purely German, and that meant it had to be made clear of Jews. In other words, the idea was now that more and more Jews had to be pushed further and further away. And as part of that idea, the Nazis extended the euthanasia program. That is the program for killing the handicapped and people who were physically or mentally disabled. They extended that program to the annexed parts of Poland. They killed people in moving vans into which bottled carbon monoxide was pumped. And they extended the program to the concentration camps, specifically to Jewish prisoners in German concentration camps. And the code name for this was 14F13. Now, what you see here is an expansion of the killing to categories of Jews. And then in July, Hermann Göring issued an order to Reinhard Heydrich, the principal figure in the SS responsible for this. And he told Heydrich, it is now, who was already in charge of the emigration of Jews from Europe. He told Heydrich, it is now your job to find a bigger solution than emigration, an overall solution to the so-called Jewish question in Europe. Heydrich now began instructing subordinates on various processes of finding out how they might carry out an overall solution, not just expelling people anymore, but or killing the people in our path, but finding ways to do away with all Jews in the Nazi-controlled regions. In September, as part of experimenting on this, the first tests were made at Auschwitz of a gas called Zyklon to kill inmates. To be sure, at this point, the inmates in question were not yet Jews. They were Soviet prisoners of war on whom this gas was tested. The idea was that hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war were going to be captured and put to work. Many of them would become sick and worn down by that labor, and therefore they could be dispatched quickly, and they were looking for a method of doing that. Gas was the method. Zyklon was a fumigant that already was lying around in all SS concentration camps because it was used routinely to fumigate barracks and so forth. In the same month, the people who had carried out the gassings in the German sanatoria and asylums for handicapped people, those people were transferred to Poland. They were sent out from Germany, obviously to perform a new task. In Minsk, in Belarus, and Mogilev, the first tests were made on a different gas of killing people. This was carbon monoxide. And the tests were made with captured Soviet tank engines. They could generate the exhaust fumes from the motors of these engines, and they wanted to see how many people could be killed in a certain space in a certain time. Also in September, they began the first shootings of Jews in German annexed areas. This was the so-called Watergau, the part of Poland that the Germans had not just occupied, but made part of the Nazi Reich. And in here, they began shooting the inhabitants of the villages and cities around that area. At the same time, Adolf Eichmann, who would later become infamous in this whole process, was part of the occupation staff in Yugoslavia, particularly in particular in the Serbian part of Yugoslavia. And there were discussions as to what to do with the Jews there. And Eichmann openly suggested in a document that has come down to us that they should all be shot. So the idea, as the Germans are marching into the Soviet Union and shooting people, behind the lines, lots of people are talking about killing. They are exploring the means of doing so. And in October, these means begin to become real. In October, the locations of the first two death camps with carbon monoxide, Chełmno in the German annexed part of Poland and Belchec in the German occupied part of Poland, the locations are identified, they're found, and the first plans begin to turn them into camps. At the end of October, the building of Belzec begins. Chełmno required no building because what they were doing is they took over an old apartment building and they basically turned that into a reception center where people would be funneled into vans that would kill them. At the same time, at the SS headquarters in October 1941 in Berlin, SS technicians figured out how to construct what are called T-joints. And what these do is they pump the exhaust fumes of a truck into the back container of, and these were like moving vans. And thus you could gas people by pushing them into the vans, holding them there, and simply running the motor of the truck. This technique was perfected in the middle of October. On the 23rd of October, the Gestapo and the SS issued an order to all German agencies across the whole continent of Europe. No Jews would henceforth be allowed to emigrate. This moment we know the policymakers of the Third Reich have said expulsion is over. The policy will be extermination because there is no longer to be an escape hatch that people can go through. At the end of the month, German officials in Riga and Minsk in occupied Latvia and Belarus actually there's a memorandum of their conversations in which they talk about the erection, the construction of gassing devices in their cities to be used to kill local Jews and Jews from Germany who will be sent there. At the end of the month, Fritz Rademacher, who is the head of the so-called Jewish desk in the German Foreign Ministry, makes a trip to occupied Serbia, to Belgrade, and discusses with Eichmann and others what will happen to the Jews of this area. And when he returns at the end of the month, he files an expense report to his superiors in the Foreign Ministry. And when he is asked to fill in on the expense report, what was the purpose of your visit? He writes, liquidation of Jews in Belgrade, the killing. So what now happens from this moment we had this process in August, September, October of 1941, where the idea of killing crystallizes. Now what happens in November and December is a translation from exploration to action. They have explored the possibilities. They have found places to kill. They have found methods to kill. And they decide that they're now going to go over to actually doing it. In late November, Alfred Rosenberg, who is the official in charge of Nazi ideology in the Nazi Party, and is soon to be appointed the head of the Commissariat, the Occupation Administration in Ukraine, speaks to German journalists at home in Berlin confidentially to prepare them for what they should write in the newspapers and so forth. And he tells them of the possibility of the biological eradication of the Jews of Europe. A few days later, the first German Jews are deported, some of them to Riga, where they are killed on the spot. The Jews in the camps subjected to the 14 F-13 order are slaughtered that month. And at the end of the month, invitations go out to the various ministries in Berlin to gather at the meeting that we know as the Wannsee Conference. It was supposed to take place in early December 1941. It didn't take place until January 1942 because there were two developments that led to a postponement. The first was that the German army in front of Moscow its advance was stopped. And the second was the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The Germans were not warned in advance that the war in the Pacific was about to begin. And in Berlin, there was a great deal of confusion. In that first week of December, the meeting was postponed, but we have no reason to think that the agenda of the meeting changed between the moment that the invitations went out, which is November 1941, and the occurrence of the meeting later in January. And the agenda of that meeting was to organize the deportation of the Jews all across Europe to death camps. In early December, the first gassings of Jews actually take place at Chelmno on the 8th of December. And on the 12th of December, Hitler informs the Gauleiter, the bosses of the Nazi Party regional organizations. He informs them that the way he puts it is the Jews are now paying with their lives for the war they began. This was standard Nazi propaganda, that the Jews were responsible for the outbreak of the war. Now that is the chronological story of how we go from, at the beginning of 1941, a policy of predominantly ghettoization, starvation, immiseration, forced labor, but not massive killing, to a policy of totally wiping out the Jewish population of Europe. Many historians have debated whether this moment of decision in 1941 was caused by the fact that the Germans were so successful as they marched into Russia that they thought the war was going to end very rapidly, and they were, if you will, giddy with their success and thought, we can do anything. Or other historians have said, no, the Germans were disappointed with their advance into Russia. They thought the war was not going to end rapidly, and they were concerned about the outcome. And there has been a great deal of argument about historians as to whether the decision was made because the Germans were euphoric about winning, or because they were afraid they were going to lose the war, and therefore killing the Jews was a consolation prize. I think this is a false argument. It didn't matter. Whatever the mood was of the German high command, whatever it was in the army, whatever Hitler thought on any given day in the second half of 1941 about whether the Germans were about to win the war or about whether the war was going to go on, whatever they thought, the problem was that the Germans depicted the Jews as, by definition, saboteurs, fifth columnists, and guerrillas. And this was the area in which there was the largest number of Jews in the world, and the area in which all the fighting was going on. By definition, that combination of numbers and the front and the depiction of the Jews as resistance fighters meant that the Germans were going to try to wipe them out. And so whether the Germans were momentarily optimistic or pessimistic about the war, the course of the war, they made the decision in 1941 to kill because they thought it was militarily essential. Now, finally, to finish up, there is a curious phrase that occurs repeatedly in the German documents. When you hear of the first deportations of Jews, and even the first discussions of deporting Jews from Germany to someplace else, the phrase is, we will deport them from west to east. When you hear of the planners in the annexed part of Poland talking about deporting Jews, they say, we will deport them from west to east. And then when the Wannsee Conference finally convenes in January of 1942, and the protocol, the minutes of that conference are written up, the phrase appears, Europe will be combed from west to east, and the Jews will be eliminated in that geographical sequence. It never happened. The Nazis always talked about doing that, and they never did it. They actually killed people most intensely in the greatest numbers where it was easiest to do so, because where the population density of Jews was so great and where the Jews were concentrated in Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, the distances to the installations that would kill them were short, In other words, you didn't need many trains or trucks. It was a short trip. And they could be killed in ramshackle installations. Now, one of the great misunderstandings about the Holocaust is we all think of Auschwitz and Birkenau with those stone crematoria. Well, they were brick, but they are what in German is called Massiv. They're stone buildings. All the other death camps were not. They were ramshackle buildings, mostly put together out of wood. They could be rapidly put up, rapidly torn down. They cost the Germans almost nothing. And so what you have is a killing process that is extremely intense. It's rapid. Half the Jews are killed in 1942 alone. By the end of January 1943, when the German army surrenders at Stalingrad and the war turns against Germany, 3/4 of the victims of the Holocaust were already dead. And 3/4 of the victims of the Holocaust came from only 3 countries: Poland, Lithuania, and the USSR. They are concentrated out there in the East. So here you have a decision that takes place within 12 months, that crystallizes in that short period of time, and then you have an enactment of the decision, which is similarly compressed in time and similarly compressed by space, because the death camps are all located out there in these regions, Poland, to a lesser extent, on the border with Ukraine and Belarus. All right, I hope what I have given you in compact form in 30 minutes is a sense of how this decision got made, why it was made at the moment that occurred, and then why it unfolded so rapidly in the way it did. I'll be happy to answer questions that arise. Thank you all very much.
Por brindarnos todos los matices y diversas perspectivas para entender por qué el año 1941 fue el año de la decisión, de la solución final, ¿no? Y nos permite esclarecer la complejidad con la cual se transitó hasta llegar a la decisión de la solución final. Antes de pasar a las preguntas, el director ejecutivo del museo, Jonathan Karsenbaum, va a decir unas palabras.
Muchas gracias, Bruno. Muchas gracias, doctor Hayes. Buenas tardes y buenas noches a quienes nos siguen desde todos los rincones en esta presentación. Nos encontramos en la segunda conferencia magistral del ciclo La Humanidad Quebrada, organizada por el Museo del Holocausto de Buenos Aires, que conmemora los 80 años del inicio de la Shoah. Hemos tenido el honor de escuchar al doctor Peter Hayes sobre aquel fatídico segundo semestre del año 41, en el cual la radicalización de la política antijudía conllevó a la decisión de llevar adelante el Holocausto. Y tenemos el agrado de contar con la moderación del licenciado Bruno Garbari, referente de contenidos de nuestro museo. Hemos incluido el dato que recién mencionó el doctor Hayes, estadístico impresionante que hay acerca de que en aquellos 20 meses que hay desde el inicio de la Operación Barbarroja hasta la derrota en Stalingrado, se asesinó al 70% de los judíos víctimas de la Shoah. Es decir, que en esos 20 meses, 4,5 millones de judíos fueron exterminados por el régimen nazi. Estos números reflejan la voracidad con la cual se perpetró el Holocausto en medio de la guerra y con métodos perversos de engaños y violencia, así como de deshumanización, inéditos en la historia humana. Esperamos que con la disertación del doctor Hayes nos haya acercado, aunque sea un poco, a la respuesta que es el título de uno de sus libros, ¿Cómo fue posible? En nombre de la dirección del museo que compartimos junto a Fabiana Mindlin, agradecemos al equipo que diseñó y que lleva adelante este ciclo, a Bruno Garbari, Marcia Raz, Eliana Ambra, Jonathan Epstein, Brenda Fischer, Gabriel Merlo y a todo el staff profesional de nuestra institución. También agradecemos al acompañamiento del Auschwitz Institute y a su directora para América Latina, Eugenia Carbone. Gracias también a Dana Ioffe por la excelente traducción que hemos tenido en el día de hoy. Y finalmente, nuevamente, muchas gracias, doctor Hayes, por honrarnos con su tiempo, con sus conocimientos y su generosidad. Estimado Bruno, entonces continuamos contigo para las preguntas del público. Muchas gracias y buenas tardes.
Bien, la primera pregunta apunta hacia la decisión de la solución final, ¿no? Usted nos acabó de mencionar una serie de hechos, de acontecimientos entre el mes de septiembre y el mes de octubre, que dan el indicio de que en esos meses, en una situación de euforia, de victoria del ejército alemán, se tomó la decisión de la solución final, ¿no? Pero por otro lado están aquellos historiadores quienes dicen que había una solución territorial, que era deportarlos a Siberia si triunfaban para diciembre del 41, y que ese triunfo no fue posible, ¿no? Porque son frenados en Moscú en diciembre por el ingreso de Estados Unidos, y que el discurso, la reunión que tiene Hitler con los Gauletiers, que eran quienes gobernaban, ¿sí?, en los distintos sectores, ahí comunicaría esa decisión de la solución final. Por eso la pregunta apunta es, ¿cuál considera usted que es el hecho decisivo, el punto decisivo en cuando se tomó esta decisión según su perspectiva?
I think the clue to the decisive point is a decision made in September. And that decision was to make the German Jews wear stars. The designation of Jews with an insignia on their body was imposed in Poland as soon as the Germans arrived. But it was not imposed at home in Germany. And that's a decision that comes in September 1941. That decision signals, it seems to me, the intent to deport the German Jews. And the deportation was tantamount to killing at least some of them. So at that point, the spillover has occurred, the moment of the elision, if you will, from simply deportation to murder. And I think that, remember, all bureaucratic processes require a certain amount of lead time to get them going. If you have the first locations of murder sites picked in October with Chelmno and Belchach, then there must be a lead time before that, indicating that the decision has been made. And even though those two particular sites were initially designated to kill the Jews in their immediate vicinity, it seems to me the momentum at that point had become irreversible. Now, as for the euphoria, of course, remember that the German, the mood in the German headquarters was like a yo-yo. It went up and down every few days, according to what the momentary results were on the battlefront. So it's very hard to designate a sustained period of more than 5 or 6 days when they were excited and thought we're winning and it'll be over by Christmas, or 5 or 6 days when they said, you know, it's not going to be over this year. We'll be lucky if it's over next year. And so they vacillated a great deal. And I think there the important thing is to keep your eye on their paranoia, their military paranoia. The Jews are all guerrillas, and therefore they have to be removed from behind the lines.
Teniendo en cuenta que 3/4 de los judíos fueron exterminados en 20 meses, lo que mencionaba Jonathan recién, ¿no? 225.000 judíos por mes, si lo vemos entre el periodo de junio de 1941 y enero de 1943, y que esa matanza se dio durante la máxima expansión de Alemania en la guerra, hasta Stalingrado. La pregunta es, ¿qué posibilidades reales tuvieron las potencias aliadas para frenar el genocidio?
Genocide.
Almost none. One of the problems is not only that the killing is fast, but it's also far away. If I had a map here, I would show that most of the all of the death camps were located in a kind of circle around the territory called the general government, the occupied but not annexed part of Poland. And the only Allied aircraft in 1942 that were available in World War II were either the Soviet aircraft, who were retreating the whole time in 1942, except around Moscow, and the American and British aircraft, which were all in Britain. Now, the American and the British aircraft could not fly from the British Isles to any of the death camps and get back on a single tank of gas. So their ability to bomb the sites was virtually non-existent. And then you add to that that they didn't know about all of the sites. Chelmno is a site that I don't think the Allies became aware of in its exact location until 1943, and by then it was closed. Auschwitz was known, but the Allies were in fact downplaying what they knew about Auschwitz because they did not want to report the stories that the Polish underground army was sending to them for fear that the Allied war effort would look like it was being done for the Jews, and that they were afraid would arouse anti-Semitic sentiment in Britain and the United States. The Soviets had no intention of bombing the camps. They never bombed any of the camps, even when they got very close to Auschwitz and their planes were not very far away. But also in 1942, they were on the defensive. So the point I want to make is when the Holocaust was at its peak, there was almost nothing anyone could do to stop it. They could have publicized what was happening more, but that too is unlikely to have had much effect while the Germans were winning.
Hay historiadores que dicen que los nazis, para llevar a cabo el holocausto, desviaron recursos logísticos y económicos que afectaron el curso de la guerra. La pregunta que le hago es, ¿en qué medida el holocausto afectó el desarrollo de la guerra para Alemania?
El holocausto
Effect on the German war effort, except for the fact that in the 1930s, before the war began, discrimination against and persecution of Jews drove out of Germany and some other countries in Europe, even before the war began, talented scientists who became very important to the American development of the atomic bomb. Other than that, the effects on the German war effort were small. Sometimes people say, and Jews themselves in the early 1940s said, if we are valuable to them, to the Germans, then they will not kill us. But the Germans found only very limited ways to make the Jews in ghettos useful. They could be employed in making uniforms for the German army. Later, they could be employed as slave laborers in building factories and burying factories underground so the bombs wouldn't reach them. But the Germans were not efficient enough in allocating the labor to have used all the 6 million victims in this process. What's more, the Germans took from the Jews a great deal of wealth, and that money was all converted into money that could be used by the German war effort, or it was converted into money that funded the deportations and the concentration camps. The Holocaust was a profit-making enterprise. And so I don't think the German war effort was harmed at all. And incidentally, the railroad stock, the railroad transportation never was allowed to get in the way of the German war effort. Troops always had priority on the railroads. The railroad locomotives and cars that were used to deport people to concentration camps were often broken down, second-rate material that could not be used for real military purposes. Much of it had been decommissioned before the war. It was already on sidings and being cast off, and then it was brought back into action to be used for deportations. So the effect on the German war effort was very, very little.
Aquí hay una pregunta que hablaba que Hitler, ¿no? En Mein Kampf hablaba de esclavizar la población eslava en el este, ¿sí? En esta intención de conquistar el Lebensraum, en el espacio vital. ¿Considera usted que la política nazi a partir de la Operación Barbarroja fue una política abiertamente genocida también hacia el pueblo de la Unión Soviética, teniendo en cuenta si fue un genocidio o no, hambrear, dejar morir de hambre a los prisioneros de guerra, el plan de hambre que usted mencionó, que no se llegó a aplicar, pero se aplicaron en ciudades como en Leningrado o en Kiev, y las represalias tomadas hacia la población civil? ¿Considera que se podría considerar eso un genocidio también?
Genocide?
One of the problems with the word genocide is that it's a legal concept now, and we have a legal definition. And the legal definition has two parts: intention, that is a purpose, and then it has a part that has to do with extent. And the purpose of in genocide has to be to wipe out, to eliminate a population, an ethnic group, a culture, so forth. And so it has to be sweeping. Now, the problem with comparing what the Nazis intended toward the Jews and what they intended towards Slavic populations in Eastern Europe is that the ultimate purpose over multiple generations was to wipe out the Slavs whom the Nazis regarded as subhuman. The Russians, the Poles, but not to wipe out the Slavs the Nazis regarded as potentially allies, some Ukrainians, Bulgarians, Croatians. So there was a distinction drawn among the Slavic populations. There's no distinction drawn among the Jews. The second thing is the element of time. The Jews are all to be killed as fast as the Nazi regime can kill them, all of them, every last one, because they are defined as the mortal enemy of Germany. With the Slavs, they are to be used. They are to be subject to attrition. Many of them will die across the generations as they are exploited by German masters, but it will take place over a long period of time, maybe 100 years, maybe 200 years, and so forth. So to get to the heart of your question, do I regard what they had in mind for the Soviet Union as genocide? Yes, I do. But it's not the same kind of genocide. It's not as fast. It's not as sweeping. It involves different distinctions that the Nazis draw.
Bien, usted habló sobre, un 90% de los judíos fueron exterminados en el este. Y mencionó, desarrolló, ¿no?, por qué el este, la cuestión de cercanía, ¿no? Pero hay un historiador que es Timothy Snyder, que él habla sobre el concepto de destrucción estatal en el este como una de las causas por las cuales se llevó el exterminio en esas tierras. ¿Cuál es su posición sobre esa hipótesis?
Gracias, es una muy buena pregunta.
I think Timothy Snyder is wrong about that. Statelessness was not the reason why the killing is most intense in these areas. It is, in the first place, not entirely accurate. There were occupation governments in places where the murder rates were very high. Serbia, Greece, Lithuania. In all of these places, there were collaborationist local regimes. They were usually headed by former generals in the armies of these places when they were independent countries. So they were not, strictly speaking, stateless. The second thing is the mortality rate was also very, very high in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is not a bloodland in Eastern Europe, Timothy Snyder's first book, and it was not stateless. The whole bureaucracy of the Dutch administration stayed in the country and kept carrying out the wishes of the German authorities. Now, what is it that the Netherlands and Ukraine had in common? Why is the death rate so high in these two places? It is because the Nazis intended to absorb them into Germany. The thing that unites the areas where the mortality rates are greatest is the intent to hold on to them. That makes the Nazis particularly determined to wipe out the Jewish population. So, and statelessness is, at least in the occupied East, a result of that intent. It is not an independent thing itself. Areas that don't have semi-sovereign collaborating governments, like Romania had one, and Vichy France had one, and Hungary had one, and so forth. Areas that did not have that were almost entirely areas that the Nazis intended to annex. So that is, I see the place of statelessness as a kind of byproduct of something more profound, which was the Nazis' idea about the ultimate fate of these regions.
Ya con la última pregunta, ¿cuál es su opinión de la negación del Holocausto por tantas décadas hasta el día de hoy por parte de algunos sectores cuando existe tanta evidencia?
My opinion is that all we can do is keep talking, but these people will never be persuaded because, as you said, there is so much evidence. The Holocaust is one of the best documented events in the history of the world. And for people to deny that evidence, to just refuse to believe it, implies that they are acting for reasons that you cannot reach with rational argument. You cannot persuade them or make them see reason because that's not why they take their position. I think fundamentally to deny the Holocaust is fundamentally a position that reflects hostility to Jews, what we call anti-Semitism. And that is a very hard ideology to uproot. So what we do is we ignore those people. We talk to everyone else. We try to show why the opinions of these people are not in good faith. And that's the best we can do.
Muchísimas gracias, ha sido realmente un privilegio escucharlo, haber tenido este tiempo junto a usted. Es una enorme oportunidad que nos ha dado y la valoramos muchísimo. Y ahora, para cerrar, le doy la palabra a Jonathan Katzenbaum, que va a anunciar también el próximo encuentro. Muchísimas gracias.